So hello and good evening. My name is Sarah Salto and I am a museum educator with the Best-Bauer Dunn Museum of Lake County. We are part of the Lake County Forest Reserves. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Dunn Museum, I'll share a little bit more of that information in a little bit, but we are located in Libertyville in case you want to come visit. This evening is our 8th annual Lake County History Symposium, and the theme this year is Eat, Drink, and Be Merry, the history of food and hospitality in Lake County. This theme focuses on family cookbooks, development of well-known restaurants, and stories of communities holding unique banquets. Tonight, we have 3 unique presentations, so if you came to our first part, these ones tonight are 3 different ones, 3 different topics. Each presentation tonight will be about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions after each presentation. Topics tonight include a local hotel, recipes and foodways of local Native people, and a wild game fundraising dinner. I also would like to start this program acknowledging that we are sponsored tonight by USG, which makes this a free program for all. USG additionally sponsors free admission to the Dunn Museum every first and third Thursday of the month. So again, if you're ever interested in visiting the museum, every first and third evening, we have programming and free admission thanks to USG. Our programs sometimes are kid focused, sometimes adult focused, sometimes environmental education topics, history topics. We have a big variety. And we're grateful that they're able to sponsor this tonight. Again, I just want to acknowledge that we are the Dunn Museum, and the Dunn Museum features permanent exhibits from Lake County history. We have things all the way as old as 420 million years old and work to present day. And additional to the museum, we have virtual exhibits and a YouTube page in case you cannot come visit us physically. So for more information, you can look on our website on how to visit us, look at our YouTube page, and look at our virtual exhibits. We'll actually be posting a new virtual exhibit sometime next week, so keep your eye out for that. I would now like to officially start our program and the 8th Annual Lake County History Symposium Part 2. The Lake County History Symposium brings together those interested in actively researching the history of Lake County, Illinois. The goal of this program is to share and present original research done by professional, amateur, and student historians to provide a deeper understanding of local history and recognize its significance in a broader context. We hope you learn more about Lake County history tonight and even find new opportunities to visit local historical sites. So with that being said, I am going to ask for our first presenters to turn on their cameras. So tonight we have our first presentation is Stay, the History of Libertyville Hotels by Jenny Berry and Pamela Kruger. Jenny Berry, who's on the left for me, is the local history librarian at the Cook Memorial Park Library and president of the Libertyville Historical Society. She holds a BA in history from Augustana College, a Master of Library Science from Indiana University, and will complete her MA in public history from Loyola University Chicago this May. Pamela Kruger is a Lake County resident and the newest member of the Libertyville Historical Society Board and a volunteer docent at the Ansel B. Cook Home. Thank you, Jenny and Pamela, for being here tonight.
Great, thank you so much. We're very happy to be here tonight to take part in this year's Lake County History Symposium. Most of the presentations for this year's theme are more based on food. And while food will make an appearance in our presentation, we're going to focus more on the hospitality aspect and give you a history of some of the hotels in Libertyville's past. Libertyville's first white settlers came to this area inhabited by the Potawatomi in about 1835. In June 1836, a stagecoach line was established along the new Milwaukee Road, today's Milwaukee Avenue, connecting Chicago to Milwaukee. The road cut through the fledgling community, at that time called Varden's Grove, after the first Anglo-American settlers, and helped secure its future. With a stage line running through town, it's not surprising that services for travelers sprung up. The earliest mention of such an establishment in Libertyville is found in John Halsey's History of Lake County, which reports that Maria Crane of Burlington Precinct was granted a tavern license in 1839. While today we consider a tavern to be a drinking establishment, taverns of the 19th century offered both food and drink, and often traveler accommodations. Maria Crane, also known as Anna Maria Crane, was the wife of William Crane, both seen here. The family came from Vermont in 1836 and staked a claim on the west side of Milwaukee Avenue, just north of the present Cook Avenue. The family was involved in various enterprises, including a sawmill and a flour mill. We don't know exactly when the Crane Tavern ceased operations, but according to the History of the Apley Family in America, on file at the Cook Memorial Public Library, the family was still taking in boarders when Calvin Apley arrived in 1843. That year, Calvin Apley came to Illinois from Connecticut to do masonry work on a hotel in Chicago. When the work was completed that fall, he joined his co-workers, the Bartlett brothers, in Libertyville to stay the winter instead of going back east. He roomed with the Cranes. Calvin must have enjoyed his stay because he married the Cranes' daughter within the year. The family history reports that the new couple took over the hotel and ran it for the next 5 years before moving to a farm just north of town in 1849. Perhaps that's when the Crane Tavern ceased business. It's also possible that the Crane Apley family gave up the tavern due to competition from the next hotel in our survey. Sources vary as to when the Grove Hotel was built. It may have been built as early as 1840. Original owner Davis C. Steele came to Libertyville in 1835, so the 1840 date is conceivable. But we know for certain that the hotel was in operation by August 1851, when Waukegan Gazette editor Nathan Gear made a tour of Lake County. Reporting on his visit to Libertyville, Gear complimented Steele, the proprietor of, quote, the only hotel in the place, a commodious 2.5-story building with lodging for over 50 and a ballroom the whole length of the house. Local lore relates that the Grove House, shown here on an 1873 bird's eye view lithograph, was a stagecoach stop on the Frink and Walker stagecoach line, and horses were changed at the livery station at the hotel. One story says that it was the practice of the stagecoach drivers to whip their teams into a run as they neared the hotel and pull up with a flourish. Another story says that at times the mud on Milwaukee Road was so deep the stage couldn't go through and passengers had to stay overnight in the hotel, which seems very convenient. Original owner Davis Steele died in 1855, but the hotel continued to be referred to as Steele's Hotel or the Grove Hotel or Grove House until 1877. During those 2 decades, several different proprietors ran the hotel. Eli Penniman was associated with the Grove House from about 1851 until 1864, when he moved to Shields Township. After Penniman's move, a string of other names are found associated with the Grove House. In 1866, S. Galloway, likely Dr. Samuel Galloway, is named as the proprietor in a notice about an 1866 Christmas night ball. W.P. Farnham took over by 1868 and was in charge of the hotel until his retirement in 1876, at which time a Mr. William Kelsey acquired the hotel. The hotel's run as the Grove House came to an end in 1877 when A.G. Fisher took over. In addition to changing the business name to the Fisher House, the new owner removed the bar and ran the hotel as a temperance house. No alcohol was served. Not all the locals were happy about that. The Waukegan newspaper reported that at a September 1877 dance celebrating that year's Lake County Fair, some, quote, brutes from the east part of town came for the purpose of breaking up the dance in a fight because Fisher kept a temperance house. Apparently, the men started a fight amongst themselves, which drove all the respectable people home. The men were banned from the hotel, and the proprietors promised to pursue legal charges. The Fisher family sold out to brothers Robert Charles and Richard Proctor about 1891. Notices of dancing parties and masquerade balls at Proctor's Hall could be found even in the Inter-Ocean newspaper of Chicago. Although the Proctors appear to have maintained ownership of the building, by 1894, Ava May Spoor was the proprietress. This business card, postcard, and tickets in the upper left-hand corner are part of the Libertyville Historical Society collection. Mrs. Spoor's tenure was rather short, lasting less than a year as far as we can tell. By February 1st, 1895, the hotel changed names once more and was now called the Commercial Hotel under the leadership of George B. Mason. Over its lifetime, the 19th century Libertyville landmark was home to social parties, political conventions, traveling doctors, a barbershop, an ice cream parlor, and a billiards room. Longtime Libertyville residents remembered the Fisher House as the social center of town, and more than one recalled learning to roller skate in its third-floor ballroom. The hotel welcomed guests in town for the annual Lake County Fair, provided a home away from home for travelers of all types, and offered a meal and a drink, at least in its early years, to locals. It all came to the end on the night of August 30th, 31st, 1895, when a fire destroyed the Commercial Hotel and over 20 other buildings on the east side of Milwaukee Avenue, north of today's Cook Avenue. You can see the remains of the Commercial Hotel's foundation and a melted hotel sign in this photograph of the fire's aftermath. Although the Grove House / Fisher House / Hotel Spoor / Commercial Hotel was gone, Libertyville was not without a hotel. The current hotel, near Libertyville, Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad Depot, had been operating since 1881. A local farming family saw an opportunity created by the 1880 establishment of a passenger train railroad depot in downtown Libertyville. They opened the Kern Hotel to accommodate the growing number of travelers to the area. The Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad had run a line from Chicago to Milwaukee in 1872, but on the east side of the Des Plaines River. The closest stop to the village was Libertyville Junction, known today as Rondout. In the late 1870s, a committee of local businessmen struck a deal with the railroad company. The railroad would equip the road and run one train a day into town, providing the people of Libertyville would grade the road, build a bridge, and provide land for the depot. On May 31st, 1880, the first train whistle sounded in Libertyville. Henry Kern and his wife, Mary Christina, established the new hotel in 1881 on the northwest corner of First Street in what was then called Orchard Street. That street today is called Church Street. Henry Kern was born in Pennsylvania in 1833 and came to Fremont Township in 1854 when he was 21. Mary was born in Erie County, New York. The couple married in 1860. In 1862, Henry Kern enlisted with the Union's 96th Regiment Illinois Volunteers, but served only 9 months after he was discharged after suffering an injury while stocking a steamship. He and Mary farmed in Fremont Township from 1865 until the Milwaukee and St. Paul Railroad was extended to Libertyville, prompting the Kern family to leave their farm, move to Libertyville, and open the Kern Hotel in a spot that was easily accessible to the new passenger train depot. In addition to the train delivering travelers to Libertyville, the Kern Hotel may have benefited from another business, attracting visitors to town, the Hygienia Springs Water Company, later known as Abana Springs. A 1903 special edition of the Lake County Independent lauded Abana Springs founder Frederick Grabby as the first citizen of Libertyville to exploit the medicinal waters of the village. These medicinal waters may have been the initial draw for the Kern Hotel's frequent guests, famous siblings Charles and Eliza Nestle, little people who made appearances under their stage names Commodore Foote and the Fairy Queen. The siblings toured the U.S. and Europe. They met President and Mrs. Lincoln at a White House reception in February of 1864 and performed for many members of the royal family, including Queen Victoria. The siblings also made appearances at the Lake County Fair. Charles and Eliza traveled to Libertyville almost every summer from their home in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Eliza enjoyed her time here. She was quoted as saying, "I have been almost constantly traveling for 25 years and more, but never discovered such a charming village as Libertyville." In a 1987 booster pamphlet titled Libertyville Illustrated, Commodore Foote endorsed Libertyville's spring water, saying he had traveled all over Europe and had visited nearly all its famous watering resorts, but had never drunk water to compare with that of Libertyville. And Eliza agreed. "I've derived great benefit from it. During the past 2 months, I have gained 8 pounds. which is considerable for one who never weighed more than 60. The siblings and the Kerns were very close friends. Charles Nestle even attended Henry Kern's funeral in 1918. Local news outlets reported on the Kern Hotel and its reputation for hospitality. Mrs. Kern's obituary states, the Kern House was known for its excellent table, which Mrs. Kern personally supervised, seeing that her guests received the best of everything. The Kerns ran the property until about 1898, when Ed Clark and his wife became proprietors. Not long after the Kern Hotel changed hands, the Lake County Independent reported, Mr. and Mrs. F.E. Clark are ably sustaining the reputation of Libertyville's popular hotel. The rates are reasonable, and the table and service leave nothing to be desired. The Clarks ran the property until 1905 when they moved to Southern Illinois. Under both the Kerns and the Clarks' proprietorship, the hotel was reportedly often booked to capacity. The 1898 article referenced earlier reported that the hotel welcomed both travelers and permanent residents. We don't have any documentation found so far yet on the date or the circumstances that ended the operation of the Kern Hotel. However, it changed hands a few times after the Clark family ended their proprietorship. The 1907 Sanborn map lists the property as Hotel Brown. The 1912 map identifies it as the CM Spring Hotel. By 1924, the property was identified as a residence rather than a hotel. Census records from the 1920s to the 1950s document permanent residence at this address. The December 14th, 1958 issue of the Independent Register mentions that the Kern Hotel property was still standing, and today on the corner there is an apartment building that was constructed in 1986. So far, the hotels we have discussed have long since disappeared from the Libertyville landscape, but our next hotel building is still extant. This Queen Anne style commercial block at 355 to 357 North Milwaukee Avenue was erected in 1896 by James Triggs. James Triggs was part of a large family connection who had come to Lake County from England in the mid-1800s. He and various cousins and siblings numbered among the prominent merchants of Libertyville in the late 19th century. In the wake of the 1895 Libertyville fire on the east side of Milwaukee Avenue, downtown was developed and redeveloped quickly. James Triggs put up this red brick building in 1896 on the corner of Milwaukee and Church, and by summer 1897, the Libertyville Hotel opened for business. The hope was to draw summer visitors from Chicago as well as locals to dine. The new hotel had 15 large bedrooms and a parlor on the second floor, with a saloon and dining room on the first floor, featuring an icebox and a cigar case and, quote, being lighted with electricity, which was new to Libertyville that year. To cater to summer guests, it offered conveyances in the adjacent stable to those who wished to tour nearby lakes. The Libertyville Hotel also benefited from the patronage of bicyclists who came through Libertyville following the Waukegan Century Course, a 100-mile route that ran north from Chicago through Wheeling to Waukegan and then back south through the lakeshore towns. Over the course of the 20-plus years the building served as a hotel, it was remodeled several times, most notably in 1902 when a large tank was erected, seen here in the rear of this photo, to provide a water supply. This enabled the hotel to provide baths, water closets, and lavatories, a few years before the village would have its own water tower. By 1919, the Libertyville Hotel had ceased operation as a hotel, and the building was referred to as the Kennedy Building. Over the years, the building has been home to a car dealer, a bank, real estate and insurance offices, and a beauty salon. While the upstairs rooms were converted to apartments and offices, the building's first floor has continued to be used as a gathering and dining space off and on throughout its history. Such restaurants as Proctor's Chatterbox, a popular teen hangout in the 1950s, That Place on the Corner, and Summit Ice Cream have inhabited the Libertyville Hotel building. The Conscious Cup Coffee Roasters has graced the corner since 2020. The Libertyville Hotel wasn't the only hotel to spring up after the fire of 1895. It took a few years, but the Proctor brothers built a new hotel on the same spot as the commercial hotel. From 1900 to 1910, 11 buildings were constructed within the Libertyville Central Business District, 9 along Milwaukee Avenue and 2 on Cook Avenue. The most important commercial building erected during that time was the Proctor Building. Designed by Chicago architect William Krieg, the two-story brick building housed commercial storefronts and the Newcastle Hotel. The block was lauded by the Lake County Independent as, quote, Libertyville's first metropolitan building, the pride of all citizens. Towns 5 times the size of Libertyville cannot boast of buildings similar to the Proctor Block. With 110 feet of Milwaukee Avenue footage and a stretch of plate glass storefronts, the two-story structure was the most impressive building the town had yet erected. All of the building entrances and the hotel vestibule welcomed customers with mosaic tile flooring. At the back was a garden and trees. Conveniences included steam heat and modern plumbing and toilet provisions of the day, provided by a private water supply. Throughout the life of the building, the Newcastle Hotel rented rooms on the 2nd floor. When it debuted in 1903, the first-class hotel was divided into 26 apartments for bedroom and parlor purposes, reception rooms, and a hotel office. In 1918, Elisha Proctor's stepbrother Richard Duddles and his wife Lulu assumed management of the hotel and building. Sadly, tragedy struck the Duddles when Richard and his son were killed in an automobile accident in 1925, but Lulu carried on as owner for the next few decades. For guests, the hotel offered both an American plan, a room plus meals, and a European plan, a room only. The Newcastle also offered dinner for locals and apparently wasn't beyond poaching talent from its competitors, as seen here in this October 1909 notice in a local newspaper advertising the migration of the Libertyville Hotel chef to the Newcastle. Milwaukee Avenue was already a main route for travelers between Wisconsin and Illinois. When the road was paved in 1923, traffic increased exponentially. The Newcastle Hotel was a convenient pit stop, as well as being within walking distance of both the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad and the North Shore Electric train lines. A 1932 expansion and the addition of 6 new efficiency apartments proved a popular first home for newlyweds. After a long tenure as owner, Lulu Duddles sold the building in 1949. The Newcastle continued to operate as a hotel into the 1990s. During its final years, the Newcastle building was in need of many repairs. Rooms were rented on a weekly basis, providing a source of inexpensive housing. In 1996, a renovation of the historic building using the architect's original plans included extensive exterior and interior restoration. New owners David and Sandra Whitmore created 13 one-bedroom apartments out of the former hotel rooms. The building was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1998. The slow decline of the Newcastle Hotel was helped along by the defection of travelers to the new hotels being constructed north of town in the mid to late 20th century, and the Hitchin Post was the first.
Post-World War II America saw the rise of automobile culture and with it the road trip's heyday. Motels popped up across the country designed specifically to accommodate people traveling by car. Vacationers could park right outside their rooms, making it easier to get luggage in on arrival and back out when it was time to hit the road again. The 1950s and 60s were peak years in the motel industry, and right in the center of it, longtime Libertyville resident and antique automobile enthusiast Earl R. Young built Libertyville's first motel, opening the Hitch-In Post on the southwest corner of North Milwaukee Avenue and Peterson Road, known today as Route 137. Young served as the general contractor for the project, building the motel himself on what was once his family's farm. He housed his collection of antique automobiles at the motel. The motel's name catered to the mid-20th century fascination with all things Western and also recalled Milwaukee Avenue's recent hitching post history. The road was paved just 35 years before Earl Young built the motel, marking the transformation from a hitching post-lined dirt road to a smooth thoroughfare for the increasing number of automobiles that replaced horses as our choice of transportation. Most of the post-World War II motel surge followed the U.S. Congress passing the Interstate Highway Act in 1956, which made traveling across the states much easier. The north-south segment of the Tri-State Tollway, I-94, was completed in 1958. In addition to catering to travelers that had new access to the area, Mr. Young noticed that businessmen who were visiting Libertyville companies such as the Frank G. Huff Company, which was at that time a division of International Harvester, were staying in rooms in Waukegan. Mr. Young saw a business opportunity in providing them with more convenient accommodations. The 18-unit motel opened in the spring of 1959. Each room boasted air conditioning, TV, hi-fi, and wall-to-wall carpeting. Over the years, the Hitchin Post grew with expansions in the 60s and the 80s, increasing the number of guest rooms each time, eventually reaching 144 units. And you can see a map of the complex there on the screen. The property became a destination for visitors and for locals. In 1973, Mr. Young added the Cabriolet restaurant, designed to seat up to 500 people. The restaurant was named for one of the 17 antique cars on display in the specially designed no admission fee museum in the motel basement. Earl Young served, as he had with the construction of the motel, as the general contractor for the project. In May of 1973, he told the Independent Register, "We've been planning this for at least 5 years. At first, my wife and I didn't plan for it to be so large, but we began getting calls for banquet seating 200 or more. We turned down at least one such request a week." A 1976 Chicago Tribune review of the inn detailed that visitors, guests and locals, could dine at the Cabriolet restaurant for breakfast, lunch, and dinner 7 days a week, attend a Broadway show at the Cabriolet Theater, golf on a 9-hole par 3 course complete with a lake, or relax at one of the 2 lounges, the Rumble Seat Lounge or the Tin Lizzie Lounge, all conveniently located on the 96-acre property. Mr. Young continued operating the Hitchin Post after Best Western acquired the motel in 1976. He retired in 1985. By the late 1990s, the Cabriolet restaurant was no longer profitable. So in 1997, Young leased the building to a restaurateur. It became Raffaelli's and later Bellini's. When the state began enforcing the accessibility requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Young decided against making the costly renovations. The restaurant was torn down in 2003. The current Wildberry restaurant was built on the site in 2004. On May 29, 2005, Earl Young passed away at the age of 75. In October of the same year, the family decided to close the hotel and redevelop the property. The remaining Hitchin Post property was demolished in 2010. Builders have just recently begun construction of a townhouse development called Libertyville Junction on the land that stood empty for over a decade. Today, Libertyville is home to several chain hotels which serve the needs of visitors to Great America, Naval Training Station Great Lakes, and businesses such as Abbott Laboratories, USG, and others in surrounding corporate parks. But the days of mine host, welcoming visitors to his or her establishment to eat, drink, or be merry, have long passed. We'd like to thank you for your attention and let you know that an extended version of this presentation will be presented by the Libertyville Historical Society on Monday, February 20th as part of our History Matters series. You can visit our website or follow us on Facebook or Instagram for more information about this program and other activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny and Pamela. And if you guys wouldn't mind putting in the chat just your names or this information again too, in case people want to copy it down when it goes away. That's always helpful to follow up on. So any questions as Jenny is typing that you guys have for them, please put it in the chat now. Thanks, Jenny. One question that I had was, how much were you guys able to research some of the guests that stayed at the hotel? And was there one that you particularly would have wanted to meet that stayed there?
I'll take the first part of the question. We don't have any lodge, like guest registers or anything like that. So basically the only thing we know about the guests were there are things that have been in newspapers. So I would have loved to have met Commodore Foote and the Fairy Queen. I just think that they're a really interesting couple, brother and sister, couple of people. We have several articles on file, not necessarily local articles that talk about them, and they had an amazing life. I don't know, Pamela, if you have anything else for that.
Yeah, I did not learn of any famous guests other than the siblings, and I really think I agree with Jenny. They would be really wonderful to meet, and I wish that there was more history on them. We know about their tours and their visits, but nothing about like their personal lives beyond their time in Libertyville hanging out with the Kerns.
Yeah, it's a shame that you can't find more about the people that stayed there, but I guess it makes sense that you don't have all the lodging records. That's something they probably got rid of. Any other questions that we have? I do know just a connection that you guys are making with all those tourists that would come through and, you know, stay along Libertyville. There's this interesting thing that I was reading about on a map that went from a road map that went from Chicago to Lake Geneva and stopped in Libertyville. So I want to go back now and look at that map and see if one of the stops was at this hotel. I'm not sure. I didn't look at very much in detail at the map, but I do know they made stops in Libertyville. So
there were definitely articles, especially when the roads were paved in the 1920s. Not specifically talking about staying in Libertyville, but a lot of stuff about drives that you could take out of Chicago, and they often went through Libertyville. So there was also some articles where one of the Chicago, I'm blanking on his name right now, he became a mayor later, but he was complaining about the traffic backups at the one stoplight in Libertyville.
Oh, yeah.
That was in the late 1920s. So it was a lot of traffic then too.
So we did get one question in here. Where was the natural spring located?
Sure. So the Banna Spring that was mentioned had eventually two different springs that it bottled from. The first one was off of Newberry Road. If you're familiar with Libertyville, Newberry is the road that's right next to the Libertyville Theater, or the Liberty Theater. And across the street from that is the gas station. It would have been kind of right behind where the gas station is today. Later on, Mr. Grabby opened up a second bottling location that was on Park Place, which is sort of behind St. Joseph's School.
And you probably have a whole presentation just on the springs, don't you?
I am, Nicole and I have talked about historical boyfriends. Frederick Grabby is my historical boyfriend. So I have done a presentation on Frederick Grabby before.
All right, thank you guys so much for your presentation. I appreciate learning about the Libertyville Hotel, and it was fun to recognize some of those buildings, you know, that are still in the downtown Libertyville. Next presentation is Flora, Fauna, and Foodways by Nancy Webster. Nancy Webster is the archivist for the Highland Park Archives and Local History Collections, a collaboration between the City of Highland Park and the Highland Park Historical Society and Highland Park Public Library, where it is housed. So lots of different collaborations there. She teaches at Dominican University as an adjunct instructor in archiving, currently the class of Advanced Archives Principles. Previously, she worked at the Bentley Library, the Chicago History Museum, and the Moloch Connector Cooperation. She received her MILS in Archives and History and a BA in Political Science and French from University of Michigan. Prior to beginning her 30-year career as an archivist, she worked as a political science researcher, translator, wait person, and bartender. Fun to throw that last thing in. So thank you, Nancy, for being here today.
Andreas Vistad, the Norwegian food historian, writer, and restaurateur, asserts that food, rather than being present and ephemeral in our lives, is important, that history is also present, maybe to an even greater degree in the food we eat. And then it is a new book that came out last fall, Dinner in Rome, A History of the World in One Meal. Writing social media entries for the early 20th century images from the Jessie Love Smith collection alerted me to the diverse natural food sources that he was describing unknowingly. And while recording these sources for short paragraphs on these images inspired this inspiration. Now, Smith and his colleague Peratt did not take these images to demonstrate or talk about food. However, they did take note of the many natural things that happened in here that grew naturally in this area which is carved out by glaciation and was ceded to the United States of America by the Treaty of 1833 by the three nations of the Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. Now, people didn't take pictures of their food like they do now. I think it's a 21st century phenomenon. One of the first interesting recipes I came across was for something called tassamonone. And McLean's 1956 article toots it as the weed that gourmets go for. Now, a quick mention about words. There's words that we've referred previously in the vernacular, we refer to as the Latin words, and different tribes have different words. And I tried to use the most common word that I found that described it. So tassamonia for Indian rice, wild grain of the water, is what it was called. It grew naturally here. It's still a little bit to the west. It grows in Michigan and Wisconsin. And this picture is probably near the prairie sloughs in northern Highland Park. And Peratt and Smith, a local pedagogue, were creating a book on the local flora and fauna. And this grain grows in sloughs and marshes. It's one of the tallest grasses in Illinois. And it was a common food source and central food source for many Native American tribes, and it still is in Michigan in this area. And I found many, many, many recipes for this. I did not find measurements or foodstuffs, but what I did find is, this is kind of what it looks like. The woodland Indians were here before the Potawatomi were pushed farther west. And this rice, I also noticed the Wisconsin extension from the 19th century lists 45 recipes, basically corn and fish and the rice mixed together in all kinds of different proportions. Sometimes they add maple syrup and blueberries, but this is what it would have looked like being cooked. And you can put, according to many authors, current authors, you can put it in an Instant Pot, you can put it in your rice cooker. And we're going to see that they don't really give temperatures. We've talked about that a little before. So corn, of course, is another item that we see frequently discussed. In fact, often is referred to as the Three Sisters, the staple Native American foods being corn and squash. I think farther west, the Middle West, as we are here, looked at it a little bit differently, as rice was clearly somewhat of a staple. And corn was cultivated by tribes and also settlers for both people and food. And one of the 19th century things I see frequent references to are corn dodgers. John Finney, the former city clerk of Highland Park, writes about it home to his family in the Civil War about corn dodgers. Here's a recipe how Lincoln would have eaten them that I found. The pictures on the website for the Illinois were very pretty, and it had garnishes and just really looked quite lovely. But it's kind of I got this image from Illinois, Indianapolis history, kind of this a lump of corn mush that they fed and they fried to feed to people. And it had its own preservation. You could travel with it, stick it in a bag and leather, and both Native American tribes and Americans used it frequently. Growing naturally here in the ravines, we have Juneberries. And one thing that is evolution that I found both in reading old texts, current forager texts, many food sources that people gathered, Native Americans or settlers, were never cultivated for whatever reason. And the Juneberry is one of these, was often used as a key ingredient in many different Native American tribes' food sources. It's called pemmican. It's really kind of maybe the first energy bar. It's made with dried meat strips, fat, lard, and dried fruit, in many cases Juneberry, which again has many different names. And these Juneberries grow in the ravines near Highland Park, and they're like an understory shade tree, but the berries can be eaten off the tree or be eaten in many other ways eaten. So here you can see the pemmican you have found. There's been evidence found of these energy bars with similar recipes everywhere across what's now the United States. Here's a picture by Matthew Brady of a Cheyenne village where they're hanging strips of this food source. I found many photos in many collections of the mallets they used to pound the meat to make these strips that they carried in leather, and varying references how they tasted, but the Native Americans and others would put them in leather pouches, and they lasted for a very long time and had many nutrients that humans need. The pawpaw, I don't know how many of you have ever had a pawpaw, I have not, is described by the Illinois Extension as the wonderful wild pawpaw, America's largest, least known tree fruit. If you kind of think about it, how many places in this area are named Pawpaw? We have Pawpaw, Illinois. We have Pawpaw, Michigan. We have Pawpaw, Wisconsin. Pawpaws grow here naturally and are also frequently referred to in foragers' texts, and they can be used and were used in a spectrum of recipes that we think of today, that preserves especially. It could be eaten like an apple, or they use in preserves or jam. In fact, I found a whole book of new pawpaw recipes, but again, pawpaws did not catch on as something that was cultivated and mass produced, but was certainly a food source for Native Americans and for early settlers. And they did grow, although we didn't have a Jessie Love Smith, I had to go to another source to get the image. They did grow here. I found that was clearly articulated in multiple places. Another thing that grows wild here, wild plums. Wild plums are natural and local here, and they're very common, in fact, and they grow in the understory again, very often, if they survive still in the 21st century, in the ravines. And they could be used in a variety of places. But of course, the first thing, and I found recipes for puddings and tarts, but one that moving into more cultivation and actually making recipes in the later 19th century, we can see that Christmas plum pudding recipe that they would use wild plums for. And Goody's Ladybook, as if you've ever read Laura Ingalls Wilder's, you'll see she does make reference to having Goody's Ladybook and reading. It was a frequently distributed magazine that women and other people read. And a little more complex with the ingredients, as you might just say, throw things together. But Christmas plum pudding could have been made with wild plums by people in this area. I did find references in some of the early oral histories done by Smith himself but they don't say what, they just say pie or preserve. So they pie whatever they could pick or find if they were growing anything at all like that. One of the most fun discoveries I made just recently, sassafras, of course, which many are familiar with, because this picture is actually from Indiana. Smith took it when he was visiting one of the teachers, but he also grew here. Is when we in our Stoopy Cabin Gardens at the Historical Society, we have prairie dock growing, and it's a pollinator. It has many uses, but I found this recipe from 1860 for root beer. It might be alcoholic, I'm kind of thinking, but you take your hops and burdock yellow dock and sarsaparilla, and you boil it for 20 minutes, and it's cool enough not to scald, and you add molasses. And I found other recipes. You could put, let's say, maple syrup, sugar, if it was available. People really, again, I'm thinking back to Laurel Ingalls Wilder talking about how Almanzo and his family had a sugar they bought for the whole year. And you could make it and store it, and and let it stand. You cover things with cloths, you use jars, and these are the kinds of more expanded instructions I'm finding later in sources about making food and using local food. Because that's a drink, but we all know this. One of the more interesting recurring references I found is something called adder's tongue. Of course, adder is a poisonous snake, and it grows naturally in this area. It has very pretty flowers and can grow quite tall. It received a 4 out of 5 rating from Plants for a Future as a food source. It can grow up, as I mentioned, a food fight. You cannot boil it, apparently. It sounded similar to the references I found to fiddleheads, which you don't see very often, but are a spring delicacy. Other people refer to it as kind of being like asparagus. But it is a fern and can be used in any recipe that calls for ferns. And I saw over and over references, do not boil this, it gets kind of mushy and gross, which asparagus gets kind of mushy and gross if you overcook it as well. I couldn't resist including goosefoot. This is another image that Jessie Love Smith did not have in his collection, as far as we know, at least survived. And it also can be asparagus or a wild spinach substitute, but there is a revival somewhat about goosefoot, which grew and grows naturally in this area. There's kind of a chic restaurant that's very popular right now in Chicago called Goosefoot. But it's also vernacular called lamb stew, and it can be eaten like asparagus or spinach. You can saute it, you can add it to soup. But in this case, I found this recipe from a Choctaw site online about, it explains, although historically cuisines had fewer ingredients, were maybe simpler, the preparation was more robust, more extensive, because you had to prepare, you had to pound the meat with the pemmican, you had to roll the seeds so they could be used. And I was at the Cliff Dwellers Museum in Colorado Springs just a couple weeks ago, and they did talk about the goosefoot. So it was used widely across this country, this naturally growing grass substitute goosefoot for a food source. Sorrel, this lovely picture of wild sorrel, grows on all continents, as far as we know, and is used in food source in historical reference in Russia, Ukraine, Europe, and it has a lot of nutrition. We see it more frequently in recipes currently as a garnish, and there was something to saute, like with a piece of fish. It has a nice lemony flavor, apparently. So I'm not a cook. I've not made any of these recipes. I'm sure I would enjoy them if someone cooked them for me. But there's this recipe for sorrel soup without meat, which is something you see references to again across the spectrum, across the continents, using the sorrel as the base and boiling it and adding something you might have and stewing it. And this recipe in particular adds eggs and cream. And that's something I don't know that you see in soup. Recently, I've never seen a soup calling for eggs, but I'm not a cook again. This is something you can prepare, and they talk about preparing it for winter, and pounded in season and closely covered. Of course, very important for preservation if you're putting up food. And this is from a late 19th century recipe book. And sorrel recurs in recipes that we find. Cabbage is not native to this country. It was brought over by a French explorer named Jacques Cartier, and he planted it, and many people that came over here, whether they're German or French, had a history of cabbage as a food source, a basic food source. And two other fruits that people brought over talk about beets and carrots, none of which were here available before, but were actually brought over by various groups. And we find recipes, of course, for them from late 19th century. We find references to people using them in soups. Sorrel is native in every county of this state, and it likes the black soil, it likes hills, and it just kind of grows on its own. But these three, the beets, the carrots, and the cabbage, were brought over by Americans. I did come across recurring comments about the Dutch. It seems the Dutch brought the carrots over, and there's lots of discussion about who the carrots were they bred by the Dutch to be orange because that's their color, and this I don't think there's any, I don't know, but I did not find that any particularly convincing. And beets were more of a Middle East vegetable that moved towards Europe and then were brought over here. Jefferson planted them at Monticello, but it did go wild. I feel like Obama and Barack Obama about beets. I really do not like beets at all, but they are a good food source. And I came across them, for example, in this gumbo with dozens. They add depth and vitamins to food. And cabbage recurrently and sorrel is found in many recipes. And I put the names just so we could see. There's the bibliography at the end as well. It tells you what the sources are, but I put them below the recipes in case people want to try to take fowl and hot water. The few early oral histories we have from Highland Park talk a lot about living off a game. And especially Mary Brand Ott, who actually grew up in Deerfield before coming here from Alsace and then moving east to Highland Park, says many years they just simply lived on game. But when they could, they gathered and they grew. And someone like Cathy Lambrecht will recognize that if these are actually a true gumbo or a true soup, but these are the recipes. And these books, again, like Dr. Chase's with the root beer, and another one we're going to see, and like this homeopathic physician wife, were very well, and Goody's book were distributed widely, and people read them. And homeopathy was, of course, coming into its own in the mid 19th century, and people, what's better for a cold than chicken soup? And that was a curative. Of course, people came to Illinois, this area, and this is a picture of a harvest in Highland Park. No, it's not. It's not. It's of Southern Illinois from one of Jesse Smith's cousins near Lincoln. They grew things like buckwheat and rye, and they cooked with it. And again, our Dr. Chase from Ann Arbor has a recipe for buckwheat cakes, sour milk, and salterus is simply baking powder. I had to look that word up. And he talks about not worrying about your drunken husband stepping into it. I do know with recipes for other buckwheat, like French crepes, you do let the batter sit for 24 hours before you stir it, before you make it. So maybe that's something, a joke that I quite don't get. But again, that's something that people would have made could make it anywhere. That's why in just north of the Lake Superior and west of St. Marie, they have Pancake Bay, because that's where they'd use their flour, their last bit of flour, to make their pancakes at the end of their trip. I want to thank the Highland Park Community Foundation funded this project. It's going to be part of an exhibit at the Stoopy Cabin. And so we want to thank them sincerely, because they do support us. And my bibliography is not showing up, but I can bring that up and share that. If there's any questions, I have a few minutes to answer them, I think.
All right. Yes, please feel free to put your questions in the chat for Nancy, and we will go through those. Nancy, I did have a question for you, since, you know, we, as part of the forest preserves, we do talk a lot about preserving native plants and replanting native plants. Did you see anything like that in any of your research, how people were saying to use native plants? Or
I found many references, both from the University of Illinois Extension, from a plant food organization in Illinois, from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, and also in several foragers books that I picked up to kind of get a better footing on what people were doing with this. There's many references to what we can use and why, and what we can cultivate for the future.
Good. Was there, I also found it really interesting too, that the early settlers were using so much of the native plants too, and, you know, almost copying some of those recipes. That's not so much a question, but just, I found that so fascinating that they adapted what they knew and from where they were from, but then took on these new native plants that they were around, and adapting to their surroundings, and then bringing their own plants too, like the cabbage and the carrots. I laughed at the part when you mentioned the Dutch planting the orange because it's orange, or planting the carrots because it's orange.
The news, in fact, it was a news article just a couple weeks ago that it popped up, and it said definitively, oh, they did this. And I said, oh, is that, I've come across before, I'm not sure, but it is not clear that was.
Yeah, I cannot imagine that being clear. So we do have one question in the chat that's popped up. Is there any horseradish in Deerfield or in your area?
I do not know. I did not see any references to it in any of the things that I read.
Yeah, I have a book that I've been going through on native plant uses and how people like the Potawatomi and Chippewa use native plants. And I don't think I remember seeing anything about horseradish in that either. And I just was recently going through it. Another question that has come through, do most of the more unusual plants have good nutritional value? Like, were there ones that they said this will actually, you know, provide more vitamin? They probably didn't know vitamins, but, you know, it made them feel better.
Exceptionally high nutritional values from what I gleaned from the articles.
Yeah.
Exceptionally high sources. And there's many sites online that list by the Illinois Extension, wildflowers.org, the Plants for a Future, generally have quite a lot of detail, as do the foragers books that I found about what vitamins and what nutrients are in these plants. And some of the 19th century talk about it might be different how we would interpret it today, talk about the relative benefits of these plants.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Nancy. But our final presentation tonight is, as Donna has been saying, is more on the merriment side and less on the academic side. And it is Eating Wild in Deerfield by Donna Stupple. And Donna taught English at Maintown Township High School for 35 years and also served as coordinator of writing labs and writing instruction. She's been an active member of the Deerfield Area Historical Society and its board of directors since 2003. Working on a variety of maintenance and preservation projects, as well as creating informational materials, newsletters, exhibits, and programs. Thank you, Donna, for being here and for joining us tonight.
I'm starting with a picture of Phil Johnson's restaurant as an apology to Phil's, because when I saw the topic for this year's symposium, which was Eat, Drink, and Be Merry, I thought, perfect, Phil Johnson's restaurant. For decades, it was a destination restaurant in Deerfield, and folks could take a pleasant ride into what was then country, have a chicken dinner, and just enjoy themselves. However, a very different topic came my way. And once it did, that new topic, it was goodbye barbecue chicken and hello raccoons. So, welcome to Eating Wild in Deerfield. Now, this is the clipping that got me started originally on the new topic. In 1955, the Lions Club in Deerfield held their first wild game dinner. And the entree for that evening was raccoon, 19 raccoons. And the second part of the appeal to me was the picture. Now, the pictures in the original clipping are the standard, fundraising pictures. We've seen them all the time. The happy organizers who are either selling tickets or standing behind the buffet line or handing over the check. But this picture includes 4 dogs. 4 dogs. So I realized that this was definitely not a topic I could slip back into the file folder. And it provided an opportunity to do some research into game dinners in Deerfield in general. First, a little quick shout out to the Lions Club in Deerfield, since they were the ones who sponsored all of these game dinners. In the 1955 dinner, the $300 profit went to the fire department toward purchasing a new fire truck. But the Lions had already purchased a resuscitator and a fully equipped ambulance for Deerfield. Most of us are familiar with the ongoing mission of Lions Club International, which is to help blind and visually impaired people. But in Deerfield, they also provided high school band uniforms, playground equipment, and a lovely iron fence around our cemetery. They're always front and center on Family Day, and the picture there of that inflatable yellow and purple lion has been a traditional part of the 4th of July parade for years. Our historical society has a special reason to be grateful to the Lions Club, because in 1977, members of the Lions Club literally built our Little Red Schoolhouse, which is a local landmark in Deerfield. But back to those raccoons. The details in that clipping suggested to me that those 19 raccoons had been, shall we say, sourced locally. And that was kind of a puzzle for me. Like, where would you find 19 raccoons, in Deerfield? Deerfield's only 6 square miles, which is the white part of this map. The population today is between, 18 and 19,000. And right now we're pretty much built right out to the edges of Deerfield. Probably the only large areas of open space would be the golf course and the athletic fields at the high school. But it was very different in the 1950s. So in 1950, there were only about 3,000 people in Deerfield, and everybody was pretty much clustered in the center of town, which would be the intersection of Deerfield and Waukegan Road. So that's the gray part of the map. And even in that gray area, there was a lot of open space. There were still some parts of farms and a lot of empty, empty lots. So it seemed to me there's a possibility there for a lot of wildlife. Also, at the east and west edges of Deerfield, we have forks of branches of the Chicago River. So that pretty much creates a permanent wildlife corridor. If you walk west from Deerfield, you don't have to walk too far, and you are at the Des Plaines River. And the community directly west of Deerfield, which is Riverwoods, even today is extraordinarily forested, very woody. Now, the Tri-State Tollway did not open until 1959, so there really was no significant obstacle from the village limits of Deerfield right into this more or less wilderness area. So as I thought about it, it's very possible you could find quite a bit of wildlife back in the 50s. And then we had those 4 dogs in the picture. In fact, that one over on the left looks a little bit more interested in getting out of the picture, but and it turns out that hunting with hounds has a long history in America. One of the earliest recorded dates of hounds arriving was 1659. George Washington liked to hunt with hounds. Lafayette even sent him 7 French hounds as a gift. And as colonists moved across the continent, of course, the dogs went with them, and they trained the dogs and bred the dogs to work with American game. And that definitely included raccoons. Raccoons are a Native American mammal, bears, deer, and mountain lions. And today there are 7 recognized coonhound breeds. Back in the 1940s, which is a little bit ahead of our dinner, but a prime raccoon pelt was worth $5. And today that would be about $100. And a good hound could tree 3 to 4 raccoons a night. So you could see when times were rough during the Depression and even into the 40s, a little bit of raccoon hunting at night could really make a significant improvement in your family's bottom line. And we all remember those pictures when the fads of the raccoon coats were so popular. Today, however, raccoon pelts are only worth about $1. Now, this picture, which is a current picture, not from 1955, gives you an idea of what a raccoon hunt might look like. When I started exploring the topic, I was very fortunate to be able to speak to a longtime Deerfield resident, Mr. Phil Bedecker. Phil's been a member of the Lions Club for almost 40 years. He was very active in all of the game dinners, and he himself is a hunter, a bow hunter. So I got great information from him on hunting and the dinners. Raccoons are normally nocturnal, so that's why you have to hunt them at night, and that's why the dogs are so critical. And the way it usually works is the hunters wait. One of the articles said sometimes you just wait at the campfire, and the dogs go off to look for fresh track of raccoon. When they pick up the trail, they start howling or bawling, and that's the cue to the hunters to sort of join up. When they're pursued by hounds, the raccoons climb trees. And I'm sure this was a great survival strategy when you didn't have predators with guns, but I'm sure you could see how this would work out. The raccoon is in the tree, the dogs are on the ground around the trunk of the tree, and the hunters arrive with guns. And the rest, as we say in very different contexts around here, the rest is history. I did ask Phil how many nights he thought it might take to catch those 19 raccoons for that dinner. And he said really 4 to 5 night hunts would probably have been enough. There is an upsurge lately in competitive raccoon hunting, something I never imagined existed. And in 2022, there were over 4,500 sanctioned competition raccoon hunts. This is the cover of the current issue of Gun Dog magazine, which turned out to be much more interesting reading than I had anticipated. I wish there were a raccoon on the cover. This is a pheasant, but pheasants were a big item in many of the game dinners, so I guess that's a good cover for this topic. And since I was spending so much time thinking about hunting and dogs, I remembered another piece of local history, and that was Willie Necker's Kennels on Milwaukee Avenue, just a little bit north of Deerfield Road. I did a little research. Turns out that Mr. Necker opened those kennels in 1937, and by the 1950s, he had space for 125 to 150 dogs. And the operation was really impressive. When you drove by, there were really lovely, long, low white frame buildings. He trained Doberman Pinschers and German Shepherds as guard dogs, and he also trained field dogs for hunting. And that suggested to me, I have no proof of this, but it seemed logical, that given the fact that the population then was pretty small, those 3,000 people, Mr. Necker did have a residence in Deerfield. And it seemed to me that if you were a hunter and you had dogs, which we saw in that photograph, then probably you had definitely met and interacted with Mr. Necker, and probably he had trained your dogs. For those of you who might be World War II buffs, here's a little extra piece of trivia. Mr. Necker, and he became a very famous dog trainer, wrote books and all, and he was famous for his humane approach to training dogs. But he was a lieutenant commander in the Coast Guard. And during World War II, he supervised, and the men who used his techniques, they trained over thousands of dogs to patrol the coasts during World War II, the east and west coast during World War II. And then, of course, the issue of cooking the raccoons. I have to say I was astonished at the number of recipes for cooking raccoons. I mean, there are entire cookbooks of recipes for cooking raccoons. And I have no idea what the lady at the top there, who's chunking up the raccoon, what exactly she's going to do with that. But in the recipes I surveyed, raccoons can be fried, deep fried, grilled, baked, roasted, pot pied, barbecued, stewed, smoked, made into sauces, and made into soup. So no problem with about what to do. Now here are two sample raccoon recipes. And I put that picture of that happy man with that little NRA hat there. He's grilling raccoon. Raccoon is a pretty greasy meat. So all the recipes had, instructions on how to minimize the greasiness, remove all the surface fat. Sometimes they were boiling them for a couple hours. Crock pots, slow cookers show up in many of the recipes. But what struck me about these two recipes is the difference in the amount of meat. Both of them call for one raccoon, but the recipe on the left, one raccoon is 5 to 7 pounds of meat. And the one on the right, which calls for a medium-sized raccoon, it's 2.5 pounds of meat. In the wild, raccoons weigh between 11 and 57 pounds. So I guess the takeaway here is if you're cooking with raccoon, you need to be very careful to check the size of your weight of your raccoon and match it rather carefully to the amount of ingredients you have with it. Now I added this picture on the left because I thought perhaps that's a pretty good version of what those 1955 diners would have seen at the Lions Club dinner, a sort of pulled pork raccoon meal here. And I asked Mr. Bedeker, what were the typical accompaniments they had with these game dinners? And he specifically mentioned red skin potatoes, which I think is why this picture appealed to me. And so they would have had, he said, red skin potatoes, green beans, salad, rolls and butter, pretty much that would be pretty conventional. It was the meat items that were a little bit unusual. And actually, I looked at so many recipes that my mind got a little addled, I think, for a while, because I saw this, notice here, this raccoon and peanut butter sandwiches. And my first horrified thought was that someone was adding like a slice of raccoon lunch meat, to a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, sort of like adding a slice of salami or bologna. And then all of a sudden I thought, wait, look at the YouTube. So what this actually is somebody has made peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and is feeding them to raccoons. So you might want to check that out yourself. Now, after 1955, the Lions Club dinners added a greater variety of meat. It seems like that first dinner was exclusively raccoon and a little ham available in case people didn't like it, but that was the only game offered. But after that, they kind of expanded, but it was always meat that had been caught by members of the Lions Club. So they did add venison and wild fowl, and raccoon was also mentioned in that meal, but I think then it sort of faded out after that. I think perhaps wasn't as popular as the others. One year they had bear and javelina, and I really didn't know what a javelina was, so I've included this picture. It's a kind of little wild pig, and you can hunt it in Arizona. It's a South American mammal. Rabbit and pheasants, of course, were pretty standard and popular at a lot of the game dinners. And Phil told me that one year some of the members belonged to a sportsman's club. And at that club, they shot 100 pheasants, kept 30 for themselves, and gave 70 to the Lions Club. So it gives you kind of an idea how much game, was going into those game dinners. Eventually, there were the USDA got a little fussier about restrictions on game you could hunt and cook in public kitchens and serve to people, and so it became easier for the Lions Club to order game from like a licensed supplier, and they dealt with a company in Elgin. Now the advantage to this was they could try some very exotic meat, like hippo, and Phil did say that the hippo was terrible. It was very stringy, not good at all. And then one year they tried lion. So his little anecdote about that is he and John Sciaretta Sr. were experimenting with meatballs. Now the Sciaretta family still runs the Italian kitchen in Deerfield, which some of you may be, familiar with. So Phil and John were working with the meatballs, and Phil said the first one they tried, which was 100% lion meat, was so tough that they literally bounced it across the kitchen floor. So the winning combination was 70% ground beef and 30% lion. That turned out an edible meatball. And if anybody would know that, it would be the Sciarettas. Now, some of you might be thinking, wow, I wish I could do this at home. And now there's hope for you, because at my local Jewel, I noticed over the holidays that they now have like a 5-foot square cooler. I took a picture of it there from a company called Force of Nature. And the entire cooler is filled with ground game, and kind of little plastic containers like you might get, plastic tubes like you might get pork sausage. So the 2 times I checked, they had venison, elk, bison, wild boar, and I think this has to be a special favorite, something called ancestral mix, which is beef heart, beef liver, and ground beef. Now, game dinners don't all have to look like the ones we had in Deerfield, and here are 2 examples of how they can differ. My first example is from Columbus Day in 1992, and that was the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the New World. And that anniversary was cause for a great number of celebrations and a great number of protests. And one of the largest protests happened in Boston. And the Native American tribes organized that. And part of the celebration was a communal dinner for thousands of people, and they ate raccoon stew and cornbread. And the point of the protest, of course, was that their ancestors had been there for thousands of years and had never felt any need to be discovered. Another example of a game dinner, comes in To Kill a Mockingbird. So during the trial, Scout, who was the younger sister and the narrator, recalls a time when she and her older brother Jem and their father Atticus, who's the defense lawyer, drove out to the Negro settlement that's on the outside of their town. And Scout said the cabins looked neat and snug with pale blue smoke rising from the chimneys and the doorways glowing amber from the fires inside. There were delicious smells about. Chicken, bacon frying crisp as the twilight air. Jem and I detected squirrel cooking, but it took an old countryman like Atticus to identify possum and rabbit. I only wish he also had recognized raccoon, but so be it. The Lion Club dinners lasted from 1955 until 2002. But I really think it would be hard to beat that very first dinner in 1955 with the raccoons. And on a closing note, I have an observation. In modern times, eating wild in Deerfield was a once-a-year dinner adventure put on by the Lions Club. Back in 1835, however, And for a good many years after that, eating wild was just about the only way to eat for everybody in Deerfield. So thank you to those 1955 Lions Club members who reclaimed this piece of history, and to the current members who shared their memories with me. And thank you.
All right. Thank you, Donna. That was so fascinating. If anyone has any questions for Donna, please put your questions in the chat, and we can answer some of those. Donna, have you tried raccoon yet?
No, and actually, I don't really have that on my plans in the near future. So,
I think,
nor am I going to try any of the things in that cooler at the Jewel. I'm not a real adventurous eater.
I think Kathy was saying that there's a place, so maybe she can put it in the chat. There's a place in Kenosha or something just over the border in Wisconsin where you can still go do a game dinner.
Right. In fact, Kathy already invited me to that, and I hope graciously said, no, I think I'll take a pass. I mean, they really are cute. You know, I think they can be a little bit troublesome, raccoons, you know, in real life. But so, yeah, I would rather not, I think, eat.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, sometimes game gets a bad reputation, but they're cute. So there are some questions coming in. I wonder if a fully cooked raccoon would erase any rabies. I don't know. You probably don't know that either, but
I don't know. And that may have been one of the issues that came up when the Lions Club switched over to a commercial supplier. But
yeah,
when it was interesting when I talked to Mr. Bedecker. It was close to Thanksgiving. He was eating deer that he had, hunted himself, and his wife was having turkey. So we had a little discussion about that. So I think that, rabies issue, I mean, first of all, the animal will have to be, rabid to begin with.
Right.
And then I'm not sure, what exactly would control it. So
yeah, I'm not sure either.
The other thing too is that, raccoons are normally nocturnal. If you see them in the day, there may be something the matter with them. They might be. So maybe the ones you catch at night have a better chance of those being safe to eat.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. This is just based on that too. I wonder if raccoons have higher risk for things like worms or parasites, so that also might be something that you would be concerned about if you were eating raccoon.
I don't know, but as far as I know, there was no follow-up article on the 19 raccoons that were served for that 1955 dinner. So whatever they were doing must have taken care of it.
Yeah, no one got sick, I guess, right?
Nobody got sick that we know of, no.
Yeah. So do you think that these game dinners were unique to the Deerfield area, or were Lions Clubs doing this other places as well?
I think they're pretty standard in many locations, and when I went online, there are still quite a few places that still offer game dinners. In Deerfield, I did ask the president of Lions Club, what had made them stop having it. And they were a lot of work to set up. And then the return interest sort of started to, fade out, and they weren't making enough from a fundraiser to make the work worth it. But Phil did say he's pretty sure that in, I would say, more rural areas in Illinois and Wisconsin, where you have more hunters, you probably still have, you definitely would have more game dinners. And there are quite a few, again, available online. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And Kathy just mentioned that the place is in Deerfield, Wisconsin, and it's braised like pot roast. So.
Oh, okay. That would probably be good.
Yeah. At least the slow cook, long.
Slow cook, right.
Yeah. That might be take some of the gaminess away. All right. Well, thank you so much, Donna. There's lots of chats coming in about this. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight for the 8th Annual Lake County History Symposium. I hope you had an enjoyable time and are inspired again to learn more about local history, visit some of the historical societies that presented tonight. Go out, and actually see these sites and learn about them. It's much more fun sometimes than just hearing about them too. The last thing I just wanted to promote is the next temporary exhibit for the Dunn Museum opens up on January 28th, and that is titled Through Darkness to Light, Photographs Along the Underground Railroad. And these are contemporary photographs by by a photographer. She's from Dallas, I think. And her name's Janine Mickna Bales. And she just went around and documented the routes of the Underground Railroad. And so we'll be doing a lot of additional programming related to that as well. Sometimes it's fun to learn about, larger history topics too. So again, feel free to reach out to any of these presenters. Kathy has shared the YouTube site for the Highland Park Historical Society where these will be posted. And I hope to see you at future programs. Thank you everyone for a great night.